cattle roping cowboys, lawless mining towns, American icons such as Wild Bill Hickok, Bat Masterson, and Wyatt Earp. Legendary outlaws, the James Gang, the Daltons, John Wesley Hardin, and Billy the Kid. They're all part of that chapter in American history known as the Wild West. In Outlaws and Gunslingers, the true stories of that special era come alive again. Many of the Old West's best-known outlaws were not gang members, but lone gunslingers. In this episode, we shall tell their stories. Five years after the Civil War ended, the Old West, the west of the gunslinger, shifted from California and the eastern edge of the Great Plains to America's vast interior. While the core of this area still remained in the hands of the various Plains Indians tribes, a powerful cattle industry was about to spring up in Texas as cowboys began rounding up wild longhorn cattle and driving them north to Kansas.
Abilene was the first major Kansas cow town, and then as the railroad started moving further west, then Newton, Wichita, Ellsworth, Brookville, to name a few, and then of course Dodge City in 1872 when the Santa Fe Railroad arrived in September of 1872.
These cattle boom towns, with thousands of Texas cowboys arriving yearly, became famous for gunplay.
Well, anytime you had a law or an idea that you didn't have any obligation to retreat, and that was kind of the Texas Code of Honor. In fact, I think it was an actual law. And anytime you had people call out a person's honor or any kind of insult, that kind of a thing, and people were armed and a lot of them drunk, well, of course you're going to have gunfights. And that's what underlies most, if not all, of the gunfights, is those two elements.
Really, they weren't that unruly until, of course, the evil liquor got a hold of them, and that's when trouble started happening. You know, they would get into arguments or, fights, and of course sometimes evolved into shootouts.
Gunfights and killings also resulted from cattle range wars in Texas and New Mexico. Cattle rustling increased. And of course, cattle ranchers came into contact with the Indians and Mexicans who were on the land first.
In the 1920s, you began this development of the myth of the West, okay? And so you would hear this very racist vernacular about Sam Bass, John Wesley Hardin, they all get, Ben Thompson, they get this thing, well, yeah, he killed 20 men, not counting Mexicans and Indians. Well, that's about as racist as you can get. But that was a huge factor of killing. Is beyond family. And of course, when you killed family in one race, then you had a race war, essentially. And a lot of this is very ugly in that way. Another way that the disagreements and violence erupted was sheep herders versus cattlemen. And the cattlemen hated the sheepmen because allegedly the sheep ate the grass all the way down to the nub and destroyed the grasslands, and so they hated sheepmen. And we had a huge war in Arizona called ironically, the Pleasant Valley War, and it was started because of cattlemen versus sheep. Don't bring sheep in here, and the people, of course, did. This is a free country, and they were shot for it.
From this milieu, a new kind of outlaw emerged. Outlaws who were no longer gang members robbing trains and banks. Indeed, in the new frontier, there were few of these targets. Instead, the new type of outlaw was a loner, a stone-cold killer. Men who were feared above all others. Among the West's lone gunslingers, 4 stand out. What they had in common is that they all killed early and killed often. Clay Allison at the age of 22. Ben Thompson at 16. John Wesley Hardin at the age of 15. And of course, the most famous of them all, Billy the Kid, at 16. Unlike in the movies, these men were not hired killers. They had jobs, many jobs. They were farmers, cowboys, cattle drovers, ranchers, gamblers, school teachers, businessmen, lawyers, saloon operators, soldiers, and law officers. Good and bad alike, the famous Western gunslingers were all adventurers, even entrepreneurs. When Robert Clay Allison was reportedly asked what he did for a living, he replied, "I'm a shootist." Born with a club foot in Waynesboro, Tennessee, Allison was known for his wild mood swings. When the Civil War broke out, the 21-year-old joined the Confederate Army, where he served for the duration of the war. How many men Allison killed in combat is unknown. But while he was on medical leave for maniacal behavior, a Union corporal tried to raid the Allison home. Big mistake. Clay shot him dead. Many Southern families after the war found there was nothing left for them in the Old South, so they moved to the New South, Texas.
After the Civil War is over, soldiers move west in such great numbers. Kansas was originally called the Soldier State. Before it was the Sunflower State, it was the Soldier State. There were towns in Kansas where all the charter members of the town board were veterans of the conflict. So the Republicans have the power base after the war is over. The Democrats, who were primarily Southerners, have been shut out. Not only have they been shut out of the power base, they have lost their money. They have effectively lost land, they've lost slaves, they've lost cash due to the war, they've lost cash crops because of the war. Republicans have the money. So the fact that outlaws are Democrats and the authority figures are Republicans after the money is just a given.
This is what the Allison family did. Along the way, Clay beat a ferryman to death near Denison, Texas. Once in Texas, he was attracted to the emerging cattle industry. In 1866, he helped blaze the famous Goodnight Loving Cattle Trail from Texas to Denver. Using the skills he learned in this venture, he became a trail boss. In 1870, he cleverly parlayed his payment into 300 head of cattle. With this, he started his own ranch near Cimarron, New Mexico, in the heart of the cattle range wars. Jarrett Chatterley is an expert on Clay Allison lore.
Here we are in the heart of historic Cimarron, New Mexico. Behind me is the St. James Hotel. It was built in 1871 by Henry Lambert. It boasted the best food and the best drinks in town, and so it was the most popular place. And it was also home for most of the violence. Clay Allison himself killed several men in here, and supposedly 26 men were gunned down or shot in and around the St. James Hotel.
Allison's heavy drinking heightened his psychological disorder and would throw him into psychotic rages that resulted in a number of killings. One that took place right here at the James Hotel in Cimarron.
One evening, it was actually November 1st, 1875, Pancho was here in the St. James drinking. Clay Allison walked in. They kind of ran into each other. Pancho said, Clay, I'd like to have a word with you. Would you please follow me? And Pancho led Clay to this little corner of the bar, and there he took off his hat and started fanning himself. Well, Clay thought that was a little odd. Being November, everybody was cold. Why was Pancho fanning himself? Well, the reason Pancho was fanning himself was to distract Clay from his hand, which was drawing his revolver. And Clay caught on to what was happening. He drew his gun really fast, shot 3 times. Everybody else in the saloon scattered. Henry Lambert, the owner of the St. James, came out to see what was going on, saw no one in the saloon, so he actually turned out the lights and went to bed. And it wasn't until the next morning when he was sweeping out the saloon, getting ready for the day's business, that he came across the dead body of Pancho Griego. He'd been shot in the stomach, in the chest, and in the head, which kind of goes to show how handy with a gun Clay Allison was, that not only did he beat him to the draw, but hit his mark all 3 times.
4 years later, one of the deadliest killers in the West would be dead himself, not from a gunshot, but from falling off a wagon. If Allison was a psychotic killer, Ben Thompson was ruthless, but also the most complex and contradictory of the lone gunslingers. His friend, lawman Bat Masterson, considered him the best gunfighter in the West, and as a gentleman, he was perhaps outdressed only by Doc Holliday.
And of course, Ben was quite a dapper fellow. You know, he was known to wear a top hat. You know, had a walking stick with him, and was a pretty fine dresser. He was nobody to be reckoned with when it came to gunplay. Also, his brother Billy, he was the more daring of the two. He was drunk most of the time. He was also a gunslinger.
At the age of 9, Ben and his 6-year-old brother Billy emigrated with his family from England to Austin, Texas. At the age of 16, using what would become his weapon of choice, the shotgun, Ben killed his first person, a teenage black boy. When the war broke out, he joined the Confederate Army. Here he began his high-stakes gambling addiction. Ever enterprising, he also ran illegal whiskey. His brother Billy, an alcoholic, followed him into the Confederate Army, where he continued his heavy drinking. Billy's drinking would become the bane of his older brother's life. After the war in 1865, Ben is reported to have killed as many as 3 Union-occupying troopers outside of Austin, Texas. When Billy did the same thing 3 years later, Ben had to help his younger brother escape into Indian territory. Ben eventually moved to Abilene, Texas, one of the early cow towns, where he opened a saloon that conveniently fed his gambling addiction. Billy joined him as a dealer. In 1873, they moved to another cow town, Ellsworth, Kansas. Once more, Ben had to get Billy out of trouble.
These two were in a saloon. Ben was playing cards, and one of the players thought he got jilted. Of course, he went out and got himself a 6-gun and threatened Ben. And Ben went to another saloon and found his weapons that were checked. They had been turned in because he wasn't going to carry guns. It was not legal to carry guns in Ellsworth. And anyway, when the shooting all started, there was a couple of shots fired, and Sheriff Whitney, who was at home, heard the gunfire. He came running out with a 6-gun, and about this time, Billy Thompson had acquired himself a shotgun, Ben's shotgun, which is a very fine English-made shotgun. And Sheriff Whitney came around the corner, getting ready to stop all this affair. And some folks say that it was an accident, others say it was murder. Even Sheriff Whitney, before he died, he said that Billy did not mean to kill him. He turned and fired the shotgun point-blank range at Sheriff Whitney, and Sheriff Whitney suffered for about a day before he died. But anyway, Ben Thompson kind of held off the rest of the town while Billy escaped.
By 1878, Ben was in Dodge City, where he became friends with Bat Masterson. At one point, he talked Bat into breaking Billy out of jail in Ogallala, Nebraska. This connection with Masterson must have given Ben the idea that as a feared gunslinger, he could earn a living as a lawman in the uncivilized frontier towns that were constantly springing up in the West. In 1880, he was elected Marshal of Austin, Texas. He was shot dead 4 years later at the Variety Theater in San Antonio. True to his own style, he took another man with him. Ben Thompson was the only lone outlaw gunslinger who was both loved and feared. Not so with John Wesley Hardin. The gunslinger with the most documented killings was only feared. Coming from a prominent Texas family, he was known for shooting effigies of President Lincoln at the age of 10. His killing instinct was well honed by 16 and completed by 24.
Well, without a doubt, John Wesley Hardin is one of the most prolific killers in the Old West. But I've never admired the guy because he allegedly had some 40-odd kills, which, even if you cut it in half, is way more than anyone else. Billy the Kid, legend says he killed 21 men for every year of his life. How would you like to be with Billy the Kid on New Year's Eve and he hadn't met his quota? But his actual tally is closer to 5. So even at 20, John Wesley Hardin is head and shoulders above anyone else. But my problem with him is he's just a demonic killer. And he's more like Charlie Manson than an actual stand-up gunfighter.
After killing Deputy Sheriff Charles Webb in 1874, while celebrating his 24th birthday, Hardin fled to Florida, where he was eventually hunted down 3 years later by the Texas Rangers. He spent the next 15 years in jail. While in jail, he actually got a law degree. Released from prison in 1895, he ended up in El Paso, Texas, where he died that same year, killed by a pistol blast the way many had fallen at his hand.
In the case of John Selman, he walks into a bar in El Paso, Texas, and walks right up behind John Wesley Hardin and shoots him in the head.
The same fate would also befall the most famous of the lone gunslingers, Billy the Kid.
You got to go with Billy the Kid. Billy the Kid had the great name, and his real name was Henry. Now, how many movies would you go see about Henry the Kid, Henry? It doesn't have the ring, does it? No, but Billy the Kid has the ring. And he had the look, he had a Winchester. He preferred his Winchester to a pistol.
The outlaw gunslinger, who would later be called Billy the Kid, was born Henry McCarty in New York State and moved with his mother to New Mexico when he was 14. 2 years later in Arizona, the Kid would kill his first man.
He had gone to find his stepfather in Arizona, Camp Grant, Arizona. He was there for several weeks. He got involved, though, during that time with some kind of malcontent, a man by the name of Wendy Cahill. Well, this Cahill man was older. He happened to abuse and make fun of young William Antrim. At one point, they got in an altercation in this gambling parlor. Billy was carrying a gun. And after they got in this actual fisticuffs fight, William was so upset at what was happening that he pulled a gun and killed this Wendy Cahill. First recorded killing or murder by the future William Bonney or Billy the Kid.
Later, the Kid drifted into Lincoln County, New Mexico, where he was described as follows.
He was notable, first of all, in being slight of frame, slightly built. He was described as being handsome, a winning personality, extremely bright, intelligent.
He was an expert in every manner of gunfighting, rifle, both single and double action pistols, and a proficient horseman. Once in New Mexico, the Kid got caught up in the Lincoln County wars between two Irishmen, J.J. Dolan and John Riley. and 2 immigrant Englishmen, John Tunstall and his lawyer Alex McSweeney. Billy sided with Tunstall, and when Tunstall was murdered before his eyes, the kid joined a group of ex-Tunstall writers who called themselves the Regulators. With them, Billy went on a reign of vengeance. Some say that John Tunstall was the only father figure that Billy ever had. Lincoln County's Sheriff Brady was part of the adversarial Dolan Riley gang.
It was several of his possemen that were believed to have been the ones that had murdered Tunstall. Sheriff Brady and several of his deputies were walking along the street in Lincoln, and some regulators observed them, and a gunfight started, and eventually Sheriff Brady was killed in this battle. Now, it very well may have been that Billy the Kid, or William Bonney, that he had shot Sheriff Brady, but it was known that there were 7 or 8 regulators there. Whether it was Billy Bonney's bullet that killed Brady, unknown, but it just so happens that later, on a federal warrant indictment, William Bonney was indicted for the murder of William Brady.
From then on, Billy the Kid was a fugitive from the law. Still, the Lincoln County War raged on for another 6 months, until all the Tunstall principals were dead. Now the kid was at a crossroads. He wrote the governor of New Mexico Territory, Lew Wallace, asking for amnesty. The governor met with the kid and agreed.
For various reasons, the governor never followed through. Many scholars think that part of his problem was that he was spending most of his late afternoons and evening hours writing his novel Ben-Hur. He was a political appointment of the President of the United States to New Mexico. He knew it was a temporary assignment, and he was really rather annoyed that the Lincoln County War had even transpired during his administration. But William Bonney, for his part, he was still running from the law, as it were. So he was unable, unless he wanted to leave the country for good, he was unable to start that ranch on the Penasco River as he wanted to. So what did he do? He continued a life of crime. Stealing horses, stealing cattle.
Among these were the cattle of the most famous rancher of the region, John Chisholm. For the next 2 years, the kid rode free, rustling and gambling in his adopted hometown, Fort Sumner, New Mexico. On January 10, 1880, in his favorite saloon, the kid shot and killed Joe Grant. Interestingly, unlike his lawless contemporaries, he never drank. All this time, he kept writing the governor, asking for amnesty. Finally, the answer came: 2 new warrants for his arrest during the Lincoln County Wars. In July of 1880, Lincoln County got a new sheriff, Pat Garrett. He was given the express responsibility of apprehending Billy the Kid. In December of that year, Garrett and his posse captured the kid near Fort Sumner. He was taken to a federal court near Las Cruces, New Mexico, and put on trial in April of 1881.
There, he was exonerated under the federal charge. The federal charge, of course, being the murder of Buckshot Roberts. But the territorial charge, William Bonney was deemed to be, by the jury, guilty of the murder, single-handed evidently, of Sheriff Brady.
Billy the Kid was now a dead man walking. Eventually, he was transferred back to Lincoln County to be hanged. Shackles on both his wrists and ankles. He was guarded day and night by Jim Bell and an old enemy from the Lincoln County Wars, Bob Ollinger.
William Bonney one day asked Jim Bell to take him to the privy outside the courthouse. It just so happens, though, that, again, William Bonney, of slight build, very slight nature, he was able to literally pull his hands out of the handcuffs. And when Officer Bell gained the stairs to the landing on the second floor, Billy was waiting for him, and with the handcuffs, struck Officer Bell twice on the head, almost knocking him out. But he was able to recover enough, and they were in a scuffle. And then Bell decided the best thing for him to do is simply try to escape. The thing is, Billy was able to get Officer Bell's gun, and he was able to shoot Bell and killed him dead. The shots that were heard by everyone in Lincoln, of course coming from the courthouse, excited everyone. Billy, by this time, of course, he still has the leg shackles. He goes down the stairs, and he's able to find Ollinger's shotgun in the office. Again, the story is that Ollinger had threatened Billy with this very shotgun previous times before. Billy got the shotgun, and as Ollinger walks hastily to the courthouse, Billy steps out the front door and shoots Ollinger both in the face and in the chest.
Billy now calmly rode out of town, heading back to Fort Sumner. Why at this point he didn't leave the country is a mystery. Word trickled back to Pat Garrett that Billy had returned to Fort Sumner. Arriving there, Garrett's first stop was at Pete Maxwell's house, the son of a rich Lincoln County rancher. Here the most incredible sequence of events in the Old West unfolded.
Garrett decides to just go inside the home. It's probably midnight. Without knocking on the door, he simply goes into a door that is actually Pete Maxwell's bedroom. Pete is there. Garrett goes up and sits on his bed and starts talking to him. Well, as coincidence would have it, William Bonney was in Fort Sumner at that very evening. He is with one of his paramours, but he does know that Pete Maxwell always has a carcass, a beef carcass, hung on the porch. So he decides that he's going to go cut him some meat off and have a late night dinner. So he's got a butcher knife in his left hand to cut the meat, but as always, he carries his revolver in his right hand. No hat, no shirt, and no boots. He's in his stocking feet. But he goes up to Maxwell's porch and starts cutting the meat, but then he hears noises. He hears people talking. And so he decides to go into Maxwell's room and to just find out what's going on. Who are the people, whatever. So he walks in, miraculously, can you imagine, right where Pat Garrett is. It's dark, no lights are on, no candles. And the famous line, of course, from Billy the Kid's life, he says in Spanish, ¿Quién es? Who's there? What's going on? Who's there? ¿Quién es? Pat Garrett is stunned himself because he immediately recognizes the voice, and without further ado, he pulls his gun and fires at the shadowy figure that has just come into the room. And of course, it's Billy the Kid. He guns him down.
And with that shot, the most famous lone outlaw in the Old West was dead at the age of 21. The year was 1881. By 1885, the Wild West, which had its start 20 years earlier, was pretty much over. The gunfight at the OK Corral was 4 years old. Wild Bill Hickok was dead. Bad guy killers such as the Jameses, the Youngers, John Wesley Hardin, Billy the Kid, and Ben Thompson were either dead or in jail. However, there was one last bastion of lawless frontier left. Back then it was called Indian Territory. Today it's called Oklahoma. Sandwiched between Kansas, Texas, Arkansas, and New Mexico, Indian Territory was always a safe refuge for outlaws. The James Gang often holed up there between robberies. Granted to the Native American tribes displaced from the East Coast, Indian Territory was considered sovereign. But their courts had no jurisdiction over white intruders. As a result, many whites ignored that sovereignty and illegally settled the land. Most were displaced Southerners. One of those was a large family of 13 brothers and sisters from western Missouri, the Daltons. In 1882, they arrived in the territory, settling not far from Coffeyville, Kansas. The mother was a Younger, aunt of the famous outlaw Younger brothers, who rode with Frank and Jesse James. Jesse even gave the Dalton boys one of his horses. Ironically, the oldest of the Dalton boys, Frank, became a marshal working for the famous hanging judge, Isaac Parker. Then, when Frank was killed by whiskey runners in 1887, his younger brothers, Grat, Bob, and Emmett, followed in his footsteps. What was to become the core of the Dalton gang traveled to their sister's wedding in Kansas.
Emmett Dalton, one of the notorious Dalton brothers, rode out to her wedding in 1887. He was wearing a brace of 6 guns all through the wedding. Of course, he was a posse man for the U.S. Federal Marshal Service at that time. It was 1887, so no big deal. Also, his other 2 brothers that were in the Dalton brothers gang, Bob and Grat Dalton, also had came out to Meade, Kansas to visit their sister on occasion. At this time, Grat Dalton and Bob Dalton were U.S. Federal Deputy Marshals. Grat Dalton was U.S. Federal Deputy Marshal under the judgeship of Judge Isaac C. Parker, the hanging judge out of Fort Smith, Arkansas.
Being on the right side of the law for the Daltons was about to change.
Then they went to California to visit another brother of theirs, Bill, and while they were out there, they were blamed for robbing the Southern Pacific Railroad. The reason they were blamed for it, the Wells Fargo agents, Pinkertons and everything, knew that these boys were cousins of the Younger brothers, John, Jim, Bob, and Cole. They were cousins, and so guess who did it? It was the Dalton boys.
Tried but acquitted, the brothers were no longer marshals. Like most lawmen of the Old West, they undoubtedly participated in a number of illegal activities. So why not take up the mantle of their cousins, the James Younger gang, even outdo them? And for a year and a half, they came close.
They decided that since they'd been accused of these things, they were just going to go ahead and show the federal marshals, and the railroads we can do this. So they commenced robbing trains. They were very good at what they did. We know of at least 4 trains they robbed out in Indian Territory, or Oklahoma as we know it today.
They had all the tools to outdo the James Younger gang. Understanding of how the law worked, they knew the lay of the land, and they were superb gunslingers.
The Dalton gang, when they were robbing at will in central Oklahoma, they were robbing trains and banks, and the posses would go out after them, and they were just so the Daltons had let it be known, we will kill you if you even get close to us.
What Bob Dalton, the more aggressive older brother, decided to do was something the James Younger gang had never done: rob 2 banks at once.
Bob, to me, strikes me as somebody who had an ego because he wanted to do this raid, knocking off 2 banks at one time so that they would be bigger than the James gang.
One of the targeted banks in Coffeyville, Kansas, sits today much as it did over 100 years ago. What happened on that fateful day of October 5th, 1892, would turn into the deadliest gunfight in the Old West. The 5 members of the Dalton gang on that infamous day were the 3 Dalton brothers, Dick Broadwell and Bill Powers.
The Daltons met their Waterloo and Coffeyville over just a slight snafu in intelligence, okay? If they had gone into the town and looked at it, they used to live in Coffeyville, and the idea was to rob 2 banks at once and they could outdo the Youngers of the James and go down in history. Well, what they didn't take into consideration is they were going to tie their horses behind the Opera House and go into the bank so nobody would see them as they went in, and as they rode into town, the street was torn up and they were putting in cobblestone on the street, and they took all the hitching rails out. And so Bob Dalton had to make a quick decision. He went down a side alley and he put his horses where it looked right into Isham's Hardware.
Mr. McKenna was sweeping the sidewalk in front of his store, and he looked up and saw the 5 outlaws coming out of the alley. He said he recognized Grat Dalton by the way he walked and the shape of his head. He watched them, 3 of them, Grat, Broadwell, and Power, go into the Condon Bank. He saw Emmett and Bob continue across Union Street into First National Bank.
He looked into the bank window and saw the outlaws with guns drawn going into the vault. He called out, "The banks are being robbed." The townspeople quickly armed themselves with guns and ammunition from a local hardware store. In the First National Bank, things were going well for the bandits.
Bob was very aggressive. They say he was shoving his gun in people's faces and shouting orders. He went into the open safe himself, or the open vault, and the safe was standing open. He shoved the money into their money bag and then started out the front door.
Fired upon by Coffeyville citizens, Bob and Emmett Dalton fled out of the back door. As they ran to their horses, Bob killed 3 citizens. Hearing the shots, the other 3 robbers fled the second bank for their horses. The next to fall was the town marshal, shot by Grat Dalton. However, the gang was now trapped in the alley between a dozen well-armed men.
Everybody in Isham's Hardware store was shooting fish in a barrel. And they just right down that alleyway, and just hundreds of shots went down there and killed them all, with the exception of Emmett, and he should have died. Now, if they'd had their horses where they originally wanted them, we would have never caught them.
8 men were dead in less than 15 minutes. Emmett, the youngest, survived 23 gunshot wounds. He was incarcerated but pardoned in 1907, going on to become a successful real estate agent in Los Angeles, California. With this raid, the reign of the famous gunslinging horseback riding outlaw was over, 30 years after it began. Some will argue that Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid's Wild Bunch were the last of the Western outlaw gangs. And maybe they were, but they weren't cold-blooded killers. They carried none of the old North-South animosity of the Civil War. by the time of their most famous robberies, cars were already rolling on America's roads. But the names of Clay Allison, Ben Thompson, John Wesley Hardin, the Daltons, and most famously, Billy the Kid, live on.